Lillehammer, Norway, 21st of July, 1973. A quiet summer evening in a town where nothing extraordinary ever happened. Ahmed Bouchiki walked home from the cinema with his pregnant wife Toril, their fingers intertwined, discussing the movie they had just watched. What neither of them knew was that 15 professional killers had been tracking Ahmed for days, convinced he was one of the world's most dangerous terrorists. Within minutes, 14 bullets would tear through his body on a peaceful Norwegian street. The man who died that night was not a terrorist. He was a waiter at a local swimming pool. But the operatives who killed him were absolutely certain they had eliminated Ali Hassan Salameh, the mastermind behind the Munich Olympics massacre. This catastrophic mistake would become the most humiliating failure in Mossad's history, resulting in the arrest and imprisonment of 6 Israeli intelligence officers, the exposure of Mossad's entire European network, and a scandal that would force the agency's director to resign. An operation so disastrous that it would fundamentally change how Israeli intelligence conducted covert assassinations abroad. If you want to hear more fascinating and dramatic stories about Mossad's most daring and sometimes disastrous operations, subscribe to this channel right now so you don't miss future episodes about the world's most secretive intelligence agency. The Lillehammer Affair did not begin in Norway. It began 9 months earlier in Munich, Germany, where the world watched in horror as Palestinian terrorists from Black September took 11 Israeli athletes hostage during the 1972 Summer Olympics. The siege ended in catastrophe when a botched German rescue attempt resulted in the deaths of all 11 hostages, 5 of the 8 terrorists, and 1 German police officer. The massacre shocked Israel and the international community, representing not just a terrorist attack, but a deliberate assault on the Olympics, on the principle of international peace and sportsmanship that the Games were supposed to embody. Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir faced tremendous domestic pressure to respond decisively, to demonstrate that Israel would not allow such attacks to go unpunished, and to send a clear message to Palestinian militant organizations that targeting Israeli civilians would result in lethal consequences that would reach the perpetrators wherever they might hide. Meir convened an emergency meeting of Israel's security cabinet within days of the Munich massacre. The meeting included Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, Chief of Staff David Elazar, and Mossad Director Tzvi Zamir, who had personally traveled to Munich during the crisis and had witnessed the failed rescue operation firsthand. The cabinet discussed various response options, including military strikes against Palestinian Liberation Organization facilities in Lebanon and Syria, diplomatic pressure on European governments to crack down on Palestinian militant networks operating on their territory, and targeted assassinations of individuals who had planned or facilitated the Munich attack. Meir ultimately authorized what would become known as Operation Wrath of God, a covert campaign to systematically hunt down and eliminate individuals identified as having been involved in planning, facilitating, or executing the Munich massacre and other Black September attacks against Israeli targets. The operation would be unprecedented in scope and duration, involving dozens of Mossad operatives conducting assassinations across Europe and the Middle East over a period of years. The mission required establishing surveillance networks in multiple countries, developing intelligence on the locations and movements of targets who were aware they were being hunted and who took extensive security precautions, and executing assassinations in ways that would not immediately expose Israeli involvement or create diplomatic crises with European governments whose territory was being used for these operations. Mossad created a specialized unit to conduct Operation Wrath of God, recruiting experienced operatives from various departments and training them in assassination techniques, surveillance methods, and the specific operational procedures that would be required for conducting lethal operations in European cities, where any mistake could result in arrest by local police. The primary target of Operation Wrath of God was Ali Hassan Salameh, the operations chief of Black September, and the man Israeli intelligence believed had masterminded the Munich attack. Salameh was 30 years old in 1973, a charismatic and sophisticated operative who had risen rapidly through the ranks of Fatah, the dominant faction within the Palestine Liberation Organization. Salameh had been born in Jaffa in 1942 to a prominent Palestinian family. His father, Hassan Salameh, had been a commander in the Arab revolt against British rule in Palestine during the 1930s and had died fighting against Israeli forces during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Ali Hassan Salameh grew up in refugee camps in Lebanon after his family fled Palestine, and he joined Fatah as a teenager, receiving military training in Egypt and Syria before becoming one of Yasser Arafat's most trusted lieutenants. By the early 1970s, Salameh had become known as the Red Prince, a nickname that reflected both his privileged background and his flamboyant lifestyle. Unlike many Palestinian militants who lived ascetically in refugee camps or underground hideouts, Salameh dressed in expensive suits, drove luxury cars, frequented upscale restaurants and nightclubs, and maintained relationships with multiple women, including a Lebanese beauty queen whom he would later marry. Salameh's personal style and his connections with wealthy Arab families and with intelligence services from various countries made him a controversial figure within Palestinian militant circles, where some viewed him as a heroic resistance fighter, while others criticized him as being more interested in personal pleasure than in the Palestinian cause. But there was no question about Salameh's operational capabilities. He had planned and executed numerous attacks against Israeli targets, and Israeli intelligence credited him with responsibility for dozens of Israeli deaths. Israeli intelligence had been attempting to locate and eliminate Salameh for years before Munich, but he had proven extraordinarily difficult to target. Salameh rarely stayed in the same location for more than a few nights. He traveled frequently between Beirut, Damascus, and various European cities. He used multiple aliases and false documents, and he employed bodyguards and security procedures that made him nearly impossible to approach without triggering defensive responses that would alert him to danger and allow him to escape. The Munich massacre elevated Salameh to the top of Israel's target list and intensified the efforts to find him. Mossad devoted substantial resources to tracking Salameh's movements, recruiting informants within Palestinian organizations who might have access to information about his location, intercepting communications that might reveal his travel plans, and monitoring locations where intelligence suggested he might appear. In the months following Munich, Mossad successfully eliminated several Black September operatives in Europe and the Middle East. In October 1972, Mossad assassinated Wael Zwader, a PLO representative in Rome, shooting him 12 times outside his apartment building. In December 1972, Mossad killed Mahmoud Hamshari, a PLO representative in Paris, using a bomb hidden in his telephone that was detonated remotely when he answered a call from an operative who had dialed his number to confirm his identity. In January 1973, Mossad assassinated Hussein al-Bashir, a Fatah representative in Cyprus, using a bomb placed under his bed in his hotel room. These early assassinations in Operation Wrath of God were executed smoothly, with the operatives escaping before local police could respond, and with minimal evidence linking the killings to Israeli intelligence. The success of these initial operations created confidence within Mossad that the agency could continue conducting assassinations in Europe without significant risk of exposure or arrest. But this confidence would prove dangerously misplaced when the operation moved to Norway. In early summer 1973, Mossad received intelligence suggesting that Ali Hassan Salameh was living in Lillehammer, a small town of approximately 20,000 people, located approximately 180 kilometers north of Oslo. The intelligence came from a source whose identity has never been publicly confirmed, but whom former Mossad officers have described as being a Palestinian informant who claimed to have seen Salameh in Lillehammer, and who provided details about his appearance, his daily routine, and the address where he was supposedly living. The intelligence was extraordinarily specific, describing Salameh as working as a waiter, living with a blonde Scandinavian woman, and taking evening walks through the town. The specificity of the information made it seem credible, and Mossad decided to dispatch a surveillance team to Lillehammer to confirm whether the target was indeed Salameh, and to prepare for an assassination operation if the identification proved correct. The decision to conduct an operation in Norway represented a significant escalation in operational risk for several reasons. First, Norway was a small country with a relatively low crime rate and a police force that was not accustomed to dealing with international terrorism or intelligence operations, meaning that any suspicious activity by foreign operatives would likely attract attention and investigation. Second, Lillehammer was a small town, where strangers would be noticed, and where the sudden arrival of multiple foreign visitors would be conspicuous to local residents. Third, Norway maintained friendly relations with Arab countries and was generally sympathetic to the Palestinian cause in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, meaning that Norwegian authorities would likely react with particular severity if they discovered Israeli intelligence conducting assassination operations on Norwegian territory. Despite these risks, Mossad proceeded with planning for an operation in Lillehammer, driven by the intense pressure to locate and eliminate Salameh, and by confidence based on previous successful operations that the agency could execute the assassination and extract the operatives before Norwegian authorities could respond effectively. Mossad dispatched Zvi Zamir, the director of Mossad, and Michael Harari, one of the agency's most experienced operations commanders, to coordinate the operation personally. Their direct involvement reflected both the high priority that Israel placed on eliminating Salameh and the complexity of conducting an operation in an unfamiliar environment, where the risks of exposure were higher than in previous operations. The operational team ultimately consisted of 15 Mossad operatives who traveled to Norway separately over a period of several days in early July 1973, using false identities and cover stories to explain their presence in the country. The operatives included surveillance specialists who would track the target and confirm his identity, logistics personnel who would arrange safe houses and transportation, and assassination specialists who would execute the killing and manage the immediate aftermath. The team rented multiple apartments and vehicles in Lillehammer and Oslo, established communication procedures using public telephones and coded messages, and began systematic surveillance of the man they believed to be Ali Hassan Salameh. The target of their surveillance was Ahmed Bouchiki, a 28-year-old Moroccan immigrant who had been living in Norway for several years. Bouchiki had arrived in Norway in the late 1960s, seeking better economic opportunities than were available in Morocco, and had settled in Lillehammer, where he found work as a waiter at the town's swimming pool restaurant. Bouchiki had met and married Toril Larsen, a Norwegian woman from Lillehammer, and the couple was expecting their first child. Toril was 7 months pregnant in July 1973. Bouchiki lived a quiet, ordinary life, working regular hours at the swimming pool, spending evenings with his wife, occasionally attending movies or visiting friends, and showing no signs of the security consciousness or the operational patterns that would be expected of a professional terrorist who was aware he was being hunted by Israeli intelligence. The Mossad surveillance team watched Bouchiki for more than a week, documenting his movements, photographing him from various angles, and attempting to confirm that he was indeed Ali Hassan Salameh. The surveillance revealed patterns that should have raised serious questions about whether the target was actually the terrorist mastermind they were hunting. Bouchiki maintained a regular work schedule at the swimming pool, returning home at predictable times each day, behavior that was inconsistent with the security practices of a high-value target who knew he was being hunted by one of the world's most capable intelligence services. He lived openly with his wife in an apartment that was registered in his name, using his real identity rather than the aliases and false documents that Salameh was known to employ. He showed no signs of conducting counter-surveillance, never varying his routes or checking to see if he was being followed, behavior that would be expected from someone with Salameh's training and experience. Despite these inconsistencies, the Mossad team convinced themselves that Bouchiki was Salameh. The psychological phenomenon that led to this catastrophic misidentification has been studied extensively by intelligence analysts and represents a classic case of confirmation bias, where operatives who were under intense pressure to locate their target interpreted ambiguous information in ways that supported their desired conclusion, rather than objectively assessing whether the evidence actually proved the identification. The operatives focused on superficial physical similarities between Bouchiki and Salameh. Both men were approximately the same age. Both had dark hair and Middle Eastern features. Both were physically fit. They interpreted Bouchiki's relationship with a blonde Norwegian woman as matching intelligence that Salameh sometimes associated with European women. They rationalized his work as a waiter as being cover employment that Salameh was using to blend into Norwegian society while planning future operations. The operatives sent photographs of Bouchiki to Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv, where analysts were supposed to compare them against known photographs of Salameh to confirm the identification before authorizing the assassination. But the photograph comparison was conducted hastily and without the rigorous verification procedures that should have been standard for an operation of this magnitude. The analysts in Tel Aviv were also operating under confirmation bias, wanting to believe that Mossad had finally located Salameh after months of intensive searching, and they approved the identification based on photographs that were actually insufficient to make a definitive determination. Former Mossad officers who have reviewed the Lillehammer case in subsequent years have acknowledged that the photograph comparison should have revealed that Bouchiki was not Salameh, and that proper operational procedures would have required additional verification through other means, including attempting to obtain fingerprints or other biometric data, recruiting a source who knew Salameh personally and who could provide positive identification, or conducting extended surveillance to see if the target exhibited behaviors or contacts that would be consistent with his actually being a terrorist operative rather than an ordinary civilian. On July 20th, Mossad headquarters authorized the assassination, sending encrypted instructions to the operational team in Norway to proceed with eliminating the target. The authorization came from the highest levels of Israeli intelligence, with Director Zvi Zamir personally approving the operation, based on the identification reports he had received from the surveillance team and from the analysts in Tel Aviv. The decision to proceed represented a catastrophic failure of intelligence validation, command oversight, and operational judgment. Multiple people in positions of authority had the opportunity and the responsibility to question whether the identification was sufficiently certain to justify killing someone, and all of them failed to exercise the appropriate caution that should govern life and death decisions. The assassination plan was relatively simple compared to some of the more sophisticated operations Mossad had conducted in other cities. The team would conduct the killing using firearms rather than bombs or poison, shooting the target on the street as he walked home from an evening out, and then immediately extracting the assassination team from Norway, using vehicles and escape routes that had been prepared in advance. The simplicity of the plan reflected both the small-town environment of Lillehammer, where sophisticated technical operations would be difficult to execute without attracting attention, and the confidence of the operational team that they could execute a straightforward shooting and escape before Norwegian police could respond effectively. The assassination team consisted of two shooters, Dan Erbel and Marianne Gladnikov, who would actually fire the weapons, and several support operatives who would provide security, drive escape vehicles, and coordinate communications. The choice to include Marianne Gladnikov, a female operative, in the actual shooting team was unusual but reflected Mossad's calculation that a woman would attract less attention than would two men acting together, and that the presence of a woman might make witnesses less likely to immediately suspect a professional assassination rather than some kind of domestic dispute or random crime. Erbel and Gladnikov were both experienced Mossad operatives who had participated in previous operations, though neither had actually killed anyone before, and both were trained in firearms use and in the psychological preparation necessary to take human life at close range. On the evening of July 21st, Ahmed Bouchiki and his pregnant wife Toril went to see a movie at the local cinema, enjoying a normal Saturday evening out like thousands of other couples in small towns across Norway. The Mossad surveillance team tracked them to the cinema, confirmed their location, and alerted the assassination team that the operation would proceed when the couple left the theater and began walking home. Bouchiki and Toril emerged from the cinema shortly after 10 o'clock in the evening, walking hand in hand along the quiet streets of Lillehammer toward their apartment. The town was peaceful, with few people on the streets and minimal traffic, conditions that were tactically favorable for the assassination because there would be fewer witnesses, but that should have raised ethical questions about whether it was appropriate to conduct a killing in such a setting, where the risk to innocent bystanders was significant. The couple walked along Furubergbeien Street, a residential area with apartment buildings and private homes, completely unaware that they were being tracked by multiple surveillance operatives, who were communicating their position to the assassination team. As Bouchiki and Toril approached their apartment building, Dan Erbel and Marianne Gladnikov moved into position, approaching from behind and quickening their pace to close the distance. Erbel carried a Beretta pistol, equipped with a suppressor to reduce the noise of the gunshots, though the suppressor would not completely silence the weapon, and the shots would still be audible to anyone nearby. Gladnikov carried a backup weapon and was prepared to provide covering fire if Bouchiki attempted to resist or if unexpected complications emerged. At approximately 10:15 in the evening, as Buchiki and his wife reached the entrance to their apartment building, Erbil moved within meters of them and opened fire. The first shot struck Buchiki in the chest, the impact causing him to stumble forward and to release his wife's hand. Toril screamed, a sound that would later be described by witnesses as piercing and horrible, the scream of someone watching incomprehensible violence unfold before her eyes. Erbil continued firing, shooting Buchiki multiple times as he fell to the ground, ensuring that the target would not survive. The entire shooting lasted less than 10 seconds, with 14 rounds fired in rapid succession, the shots echoing through the quiet residential neighborhood and alerting residents that something terrible was happening. Toril knelt beside her husband, screaming his name and attempting to stop the bleeding from his wounds, her hands quickly covered in blood as she desperately tried to help him. Buchiki was still conscious for a few moments, looking at his wife with confusion and pain in his eyes, unable to speak or to understand why this was happening to him. Witnesses who lived in nearby apartments heard the shots and Toril's screams, and looked out their windows to see a woman kneeling beside a man who was lying in a pool of blood, and a man and woman running away from the scene toward a waiting vehicle. Several witnesses immediately called the police, reporting that someone had been shot and that the shooters were fleeing in a car. The assassination team had planned to be out of Lillehammer within minutes of the shooting, using escape vehicles that were positioned at strategic locations and that would carry them to Oslo, where they would board flights to leave Norway before police could establish roadblocks or airport surveillance. But the escape plan immediately began to fall apart due to a series of mistakes and miscommunications that would ultimately result in the capture of 6 operatives. The first problem was that several witnesses had observed the escape vehicle and had noted its license plate number, information they immediately provided to police when they called to report the shooting. The second problem was that the escape vehicle became separated from the support vehicles that were supposed to provide security and coordination, leaving the assassination team driving alone, without backup or guidance. Norwegian police responded to the shooting reports with surprising speed and effectiveness, immediately dispatching patrol units to the scene and issuing alerts to officers throughout the region to watch for the vehicle that had been identified by witnesses. The police response was coordinated by local investigators, who had limited experience with international terrorism or professional assassinations, but who approached the case as a murder investigation, and who applied standard police procedures that proved remarkably effective at tracking down the perpetrators. Within an hour of the shooting, police had established checkpoints on roads leading out of Lillehammer, and had begun reviewing registration records for the vehicle that had been spotted at the scene. The escape vehicle was registered to a woman named Marianne Gladnikoff, who had rented it using false identity documents, but who had provided an address in Oslo that police were able to trace. The connection between the vehicle and the Oslo address gave police their first lead that the shooting might involve multiple people and might be part of a more complex operation than a simple murder. Police dispatched units to the Oslo address, where they discovered another apartment that had been rented by individuals using suspicious documentation, and they began surveillance of the location to see if anyone would return there. Meanwhile, the assassination team had abandoned the original escape vehicle and had obtained another car, but they were unsure where to go or what to do next because their communications with the coordination team had broken down and they had no way to receive updated instructions. Dan Erbil and Marianne Gladnikoff decided to drive to Oslo, hoping to make contact with other team members and to arrange extraction from Norway, but they were unaware that police had already identified their safe house and were watching it. When they arrived at the Oslo apartment in the early morning hours of July 22nd, police arrested them immediately, catching them completely by surprise before they could resist or escape. The arrest of Erbil and Gladnikoff provided police with their first confirmation that the shooting was not a random crime, but was a planned operation involving professional operatives using false identities and sophisticated procedures. Police interrogated Erbil and Gladnikoff separately, attempting to determine who they were working for, and whether other operatives were involved in the operation. Initially, both refused to provide any information beyond the false identities they had been using, maintaining cover and hoping that Mossad would somehow arrange their release or escape. But Norwegian investigators were persistent and methodical, documenting the false passports and identity documents the operatives had been carrying, tracing their movements through hotel records and rental car agreements, and building a comprehensive picture of the operation that revealed a network of multiple individuals who had been in Lillehammer at the time of the shooting. The investigation led police to identify 4 more Mossad operatives who had been involved in the operation: Sylvia Raphael, Abraham Gemmer, Zwi Steinberg, and Michael Dorf. Raphael was a South African-born Mossad officer who had served as a surveillance specialist and coordinator for the operation. Gemmer and Steinberg were Israeli operatives who had provided logistical support, including renting vehicles and apartments that were used by the assassination team. Dorf was a communications specialist who had coordinated the operation's internal communications. All 4 were arrested within days of the shooting, as Norwegian police systematically tracked down everyone who had been connected to the operation through vehicle rentals, hotel registrations, and telephone records. The arrests shocked Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv and created immediate crisis for Israeli intelligence and for the Israeli government. Never before had so many Mossad operatives been captured simultaneously during a single operation, and never before had an operation gone so catastrophically wrong in a friendly Western country, where the political and diplomatic consequences would be severe. Israeli officials initially considered various options for responding to the crisis, including attempting to negotiate the operatives' release through diplomatic channels, mounting a rescue operation to break them out of Norwegian custody, or simply denying any Israeli involvement and allowing the operatives to face Norwegian justice while maintaining their cover identities. Ultimately, Israel chose a strategy of limited acknowledgement, privately confirming to Norwegian authorities that the arrested individuals were Israeli intelligence officers, while publicly maintaining ambiguity about the operation's purpose and authorization. The Norwegian investigation into Ahmed Bouchiki's death quickly established that he had no connection whatsoever to Palestinian terrorism or to Ali Hassan Salameh. Police interviewed Bouchiki's employer at the swimming pool, his neighbors, his friends, and his family members in Morocco, all of whom confirmed that he was an ordinary immigrant worker who had no involvement in politics and no connection to any militant organizations. The investigation revealed that Bouchiki had been living openly in Lillehammer for years, working regular hours, paying his taxes, and maintaining a completely normal life that was inconsistent with being a terrorist operative in hiding. Medical examination of Bouchiki's body confirmed that he had been shot 14 times at close range with a 9mm pistol, and forensic analysis of the crime scene provided additional evidence about how the assassination had been conducted and who had been present. The revelation that Mossad had killed an innocent man created enormous controversy in Norway and internationally. Norwegian politicians and media condemned the assassination as a violation of Norwegian sovereignty, as an act of state-sponsored terrorism on Norwegian soil, and as a catastrophic intelligence failure that demonstrated the dangers of allowing foreign intelligence services to conduct covert operations without oversight or accountability. The Norwegian government demanded a full explanation from Israel about who had authorized the operation, how the misidentification had occurred, and what procedures Israel would implement to prevent similar incidents in the future. Norwegian prosecutors charged the 6 arrested Mossad operatives with murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and violations of Norwegian weapons laws, charges that carried potential sentences of up to 21 years in prison. The trial of the Mossad operatives began in January 1974 and lasted several weeks, attracting intense media attention from around the world. The proceedings were conducted in Norwegian courts, under Norwegian law, with the defendants represented by Norwegian defense attorneys who had been retained by the Israeli government. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence that the defendants had planned and executed Ahmed Bouchiki's murder, including testimony from witnesses who had seen the shooting, forensic evidence linking the defendants to the crime scene and to the weapons that had been used, and documentation of the false identities and the operational infrastructure that had been established to support the assassination. The defense strategy focused on arguing that the defendants had genuinely believed they were targeting a dangerous terrorist, and that their actions, while tragic in hindsight, had been conducted in good faith based on intelligence they had received from their superiors. Dan Erbel and Marianne Gladnikoff, as the actual shooters, faced the most serious charges and the most severe potential sentences. During the trial, both acknowledged their roles in the shooting, but maintained that they had believed they were eliminating Ali Hassan Salameh, and that they had been following orders from Israeli intelligence authorities, who had assured them the identification was correct. Erbil testified that he had never questioned whether the target was correctly identified, because he trusted the intelligence assessments that had been provided to him, and because he believed that multiple levels of verification had been conducted before the operation was authorized. Gladnikov similarly testified that she had relied on assurances from senior Mossad officers that the target was confirmed to be Salameh, and that she had assumed proper identification procedures had been followed. Sylvia Raphael, Abraham Gemmer, Zwi Steinberg, and Michael Dorf faced lesser charges related to their support roles in the operation, but they were still accused of being accomplices to murder and of conspiring to commit the crime. Raphael, who was perhaps the most prominent of the arrested operatives due to her previous work on successful Mossad operations, maintained a dignified demeanor throughout the trial, refusing to provide details about Mossad's operational methods or organizational structure, but acknowledging her general involvement in the operation. Gemmer, Steinberg, and Dorf similarly declined to provide detailed testimony about Mossad's procedures, citing obligations to protect classified information and to protect other operatives who had not been arrested. The trial revealed significant information about how Mossad conducted covert operations in Europe, including details about the false identity documents the agency manufactured for its operatives, the safe houses and support networks it maintained in various European cities, and the operational procedures it used for surveillance and assassination missions. Much of this information was not previously known to European intelligence services or law enforcement agencies, and its public exposure during the trial compromised Mossad's operational capabilities throughout Europe. Intelligence agencies in Britain, France, Germany, and other countries where Mossad had conducted operations began reviewing their own unsolved cases to determine whether any might have involved Israeli operatives, and several countries initiated investigations into suspected Mossad activities on their territory. In February 1974, the Norwegian court delivered its verdict, convicting all 6 defendants of murder or conspiracy to commit murder. Dan Erbil and Marianne Gladnikov received the longest sentences. Erbil was sentenced to 5.5 years in prison, while Gladnikov received 5 years. Sylvia Raphael was sentenced to 5.5 years, reflecting the court's assessment that her coordinating role had been critical to the operation's execution. Abraham Gemmer received 5 years, Zwi Steinberg received 3 years, and Michael Dorf received 1 year. The sentences were relatively lenient by Norwegian standards for murder convictions, reflecting the court's acknowledgement that the defendants had believed they were acting against a legitimate terrorist target, and that they had not intended to kill an innocent person. Nevertheless, the convictions represented a humiliating defeat for Mossad and for Israel, marking the first time in the agency's history that operatives had been convicted of crimes related to their intelligence activities. The convicted operatives began serving their sentences in Norwegian prisons, where they were treated as political prisoners rather than as common criminals. Norwegian authorities provided them with reasonable conditions and allowed them regular contact with Israeli diplomatic representatives, who monitored their treatment and advocated for their early release. Israeli officials conducted negotiations with Norwegian authorities throughout 1974 and into 1975, seeking arrangements that would allow the operatives to be released and returned to Israel. The negotiations were complicated by Norwegian public opinion, which remained strongly opposed to the assassination, and which viewed leniency toward the convicted operatives as being inappropriate given the severity of their crime. Ultimately, Norwegian authorities agreed to release the operatives early on humanitarian grounds, and in recognition of the improving relationship between Norway and Israel. In late 1975, after serving less than 2 years of their sentences, all 6 operatives were released from prison and deported to Israel. The release was controversial in Norway, with critics arguing that it represented inadequate punishment for murder and that it sent the wrong message about accountability for intelligence operations that resulted in innocent deaths. Supporters of the release argued that the operatives had already served sufficient time, given the circumstances of the case, and that continued imprisonment would serve no useful purpose and would only perpetuate tensions between Norway and Israel. The Lillehammer Affair had profound consequences for Mossad and for Israeli intelligence operations. The most immediate consequence was the resignation of Mossad Director Zvi Zamir, who took personal responsibility for the operation's failure and for the catastrophic misidentification that had resulted in an innocent man's death. Zamir's resignation in September 1974 represented an acknowledgement that the operation had been fundamentally flawed from its inception, and that senior leadership bore ultimate responsibility for the failures of judgment and procedure that had led to the disaster. Zamir was replaced by Yitzhak Hofi, who was tasked with rebuilding Mossad's operational capabilities and with implementing reforms to prevent similar failures in the future. The exposure of Mossad operatives and infrastructure in Europe forced the agency to completely rebuild its European networks. Safe houses, cover identities, support agents, and operational procedures that had been developed over years were now compromised and had to be abandoned. European intelligence services and police forces became more vigilant about monitoring for Israeli intelligence activities on their territory, making it significantly more difficult for Mossad to conduct covert operations without detection. The agency was forced to invest tremendous resources in creating new operational infrastructure, developing new cover identities and legends for its operatives, and establishing new protocols for conducting operations in environments where host governments were actively looking for signs of Mossad activity. Perhaps the most significant consequence of the Lillehammer Affair was the fundamental reform of Mossad's target identification and operation authorization procedures. The investigation into how the misidentification had occurred revealed multiple failures at various levels of the organization. The field operatives in Lillehammer had been too eager to confirm their target, and had interpreted ambiguous evidence in ways that supported their desired conclusion. The analysts in Tel Aviv had conducted insufficient verification of the identification, and had failed to apply rigorous standards before confirming that the target was indeed Salameh. Senior commanders had authorized the assassination without requiring the level of proof that should have been standard for operations involving lethal force against individuals in foreign countries. In response to these failures, Mossad implemented new procedures, requiring multiple independent sources of confirmation before targets could be identified for assassination operations. The new protocols mandated that identifications based primarily on photographic comparison must be supplemented by additional verification through biometric data, through human sources who could provide positive identification based on personal knowledge of the target, or through extended surveillance that could establish behavioral patterns consistent with the target's known activities and associations. The reforms also required that senior commanders personally review identification evidence before authorizing lethal operations, and that operations could be delayed or canceled if commanders determined that identification certainty was insufficient to justify the risks. The Lillehammer Affair also forced Israeli political and military leadership to confront difficult questions about the limits of acceptable action in counterterrorism operations. The willingness to conduct an assassination in a small Norwegian town based on questionable identification had reflected a mindset within parts of the Israeli security establishment that eliminating high-value terrorist targets justified substantial risks, and that operational speed was more important than verification certainty. The disaster in Lillehammer demonstrated that this mindset could lead to catastrophic mistakes that not only resulted in innocent deaths, but also undermined Israel's international standing and compromised its intelligence capabilities. Israeli officials acknowledged, at least privately, that the operation had been poorly planned and poorly executed, and that future operations would require more careful assessment of risks and more rigorous standards for authorization. For Ahmed Bouchiki's family, the Lillehammer Affair brought trauma that would last for decades. Toril Bouchiki was left widowed and pregnant, having witnessed her husband's murder in circumstances that made no sense to her, and that robbed her of the life they had been building together. She gave birth to their daughter several months after the assassination, raising the child alone, while dealing with the psychological aftermath of the violence she had witnessed. The Norwegian government provided financial compensation to Toril and to Ahmed's family in Morocco, acknowledging that Norwegian authorities had failed to prevent a foreign intelligence service from conducting a lethal operation on Norwegian soil, and that the victims deserved support and recognition. Israel eventually provided additional compensation through diplomatic channels, though no amount of money could address the fundamental injustice of Ahmed's death or restore what had been taken from his family. The The question of whether Ali Hassan Salameh ever actually visited Lillehammer has never been definitively answered. Some intelligence analysts have speculated that Salameh may have been in Norway at some point, and that the information Mossad received was partially correct, but that Mossad operatives had mistakenly identified Buchiki instead of conducting sufficient surveillance to locate the actual target. Other analysts believe the initial intelligence was simply wrong, and that Salameh was never in Lillehammer at all. Salameh himself was not killed in Norway. He continued operating for several more years after the Lillehammer Affair, conducting additional attacks against Israeli targets and maintaining his role as one of the PLO's most prominent operatives. Mossad eventually succeeded in assassinating Salameh in January 1979 in Beirut, using a car bomb that killed him and several bodyguards. That operation was carefully planned over months of surveillance, and was authorized only after Mossad had obtained multiple sources of confirmation that the target was indeed Salameh and not another case of mistaken identity. The legacy of the Lillehammer Affair continues to influence discussions about intelligence operations, targeted killings, and the accountability of intelligence services for their actions abroad. The case is studied in intelligence training programs around the world as an example of how cognitive biases, operational pressure, and inadequate verification procedures can lead to catastrophic failures. It serves as a reminder that intelligence work, particularly operations involving lethal force, requires extraordinary care in establishing facts and in ensuring that actions are based on reliable information, rather than on assumptions or on circumstantial evidence that could be misinterpreted. The case also raises questions about whether intelligence services should be authorized to conduct assassinations in foreign countries without the knowledge or consent of host governments, and about what legal and ethical frameworks should govern such operations. For Mossad, the Lillehammer Affair represents the lowest point in the agency's operational history, a failure so complete that it forced fundamental changes in how the organization conducts its most sensitive operations. The arrest and imprisonment of 6 operatives, the exposure of operational infrastructure throughout Europe, the resignation of the agency's director, and most importantly, the death of an innocent man who was killed because intelligence officers made catastrophic mistakes in identification and judgment. These consequences created lasting institutional memory within Mossad about the importance of verification, about the dangers of confirmation bias and operational overconfidence, and about the moral responsibility that comes with the power to take human life in service of national security objectives. The reforms implemented after Lillehammer made Mossad more cautious and more rigorous in its operational procedures, particularly regarding targeted killings. The agency developed more sophisticated identification technologies, including improved photographic analysis systems, biometric databases, and surveillance techniques that could provide multiple streams of evidence about target identity. It created organizational structures that separated intelligence analysts who identified targets from operational commanders who authorized missions, reducing the risk that operational pressure would influence analytical judgments. It established review procedures that required independent verification of target identification before operations could proceed, creating checkpoints where missions could be questioned or canceled if evidence was insufficient. These reforms came at a cost in terms of operational tempo and flexibility. Operations that might previously have been authorized quickly based on preliminary intelligence now required extended preparation and verification before they could proceed. Targets who might have been eliminated immediately were sometimes lost because the time required for proper identification allowed them to move to new locations before operations could be executed. But Mossad leadership determined that this cost was acceptable compared to the risks of repeating the Lillehammer disaster, and that patient, careful operations that achieved correct results were preferable to rapid operations that might eliminate the wrong people and create political disasters. The story of the Lillehammer Affair is ultimately a story about the human consequences of intelligence failures, and about the limitations of even the most capable intelligence services when they operate under pressure and without adequate verification of their information. It demonstrates that sophisticated operational capabilities and extensive training cannot compensate for fundamental failures in establishing basic facts about who targets actually are and whether they represent legitimate threats. And it serves as a permanent reminder that intelligence operations, particularly those involving lethal force, must be conducted with extraordinary care and with constant awareness that mistakes can result in innocent deaths and in consequences that reverberate far beyond the immediate operational context. Ahmed Bouchiki died on a quiet street in a Norwegian town because intelligence officers convinced themselves they had found a terrorist mastermind when they had actually found a waiter walking home with his pregnant wife. That tragedy changed how one of the world's most effective intelligence services conducts its operations and created a legacy that continues to influence intelligence practice more than 50 years later.